So this is a chemical. Peracetic acid is a chemical that has wide use, and it works very well to kill microorganisms, and it's not harmful in that majorly diluted form.
Rising above the buzz of ultrasonic cleaners and the clanking of stainless steel are the ideas and voices that are changing an industry. You're listening to the Beyond Clean podcast, the central nexus for the people, processes, and products that are improving our sterile processing world. Each week, we speak with the frontline technicians, CEOs, engineers, and entrepreneurs with a common goal to help you fight dirty. Every instrument, every time. Whether you are tuning in for education or inspiration, we're wicked glad you did. Now, turn on those washes and turn up the volume. It's time to go Beyond Clean.
On this Vendor Spotlight, we speak with David Hilliker, President and CEO at ChemDAQ. And I'm really excited to just continue an ongoing conversation with David today. We're going to be talking about terms that you've probably heard us reference on prior podcasts if you've heard David speak before, or if you've engaged in any of their social media education. But I think really talking about what is NIOSH and what is their role? Who is OSHA and what do they do? And then common terms when you talk about exposure, like parts per million, time-weighted averages, and short-term exposure limits. That's all coming up on this Vendor Spotlight with David Hilliker, President and CEO at ChemDAQ.
From 17 studios, you're listening to Beyond Clean, the global voice of sterile processing.
Joining us now is a familiar face to Beyond Clean, or I should say a familiar voice to Beyond Clean, David Hilliker, President and CEO at ChemDAQ. And David, we've had you on several shows, so welcome back once again to Beyond Clean.
Thank you, Justin. I'm very happy to be with you again. It's been a while.
It has. And, I'm glad you're back because I think that this is an important message that you have to share. And I like that we have you come back and talk about it. And also from different angles every time. There's so much to say when we talk about chemical monitoring that, really 1 20 or 30 minute podcast doesn't get all of the topics covered. And so I think continuing to have this conversation here on Beyond Clean is really beneficial to our audience. And I know many frontline technicians, take this very seriously and are concerned. And I'm sure in your work with hospital managers, directors, and frontline staff and SPD that, they understand the concern. And so we're going to talk, some more detail today, but just in case there's a growing audience for Beyond Clean. So just in case somebody has not listened to one of our prior podcasts, I'd like you to start just by telling everybody who ChemDAQ is and what it is that you do, not only in the hospital market and healthcare, but for lots of other industries as well.
Oh boy, you're giving me a wide berth here, Justin. Yes, ChemDAQ's, let me just start out by saying ChemDAQ's mission is to protect people from overexposure to toxic chemicals in their workplace. It's very direct. That's all we do. And we feel like we do it. Well, we're the leader in the industries that we're in. And as you mentioned, we are in multiple industries. We started in healthcare, and that is still our primary industry. And I'll get into that a little bit later. But we're also in food and beverage, the food and beverage industry, and we're in commercial ethylene oxide or commercial medical device sterilization. But we can break down food and beverage by protein processing, meat and poultry processing, and aseptic packaging. These are very, very interesting markets that coincidentally use the same biocides. And it's a different nomenclature. In those industries, they're biocides. In your industry, they're sterilants. So, but they're the same thing. And they use, for instance, peracetic acid. Peracetic acid is used in hospitals, obviously, in AERs to disinfect, high-level disinfection, sterilization. It's a liquid chemical sterilant. So this is also used, believe it or not, to disinfect the food that we eat, the meat, the poultry that goes through the poultry processing operation, literally dips it and sprays it with peracetic acid. So in healthcare, you're using this to reduce or eliminate infection. And in food and beverage or in poultry processing, you're using it to prevent foodborne illness.
We heard a lot about that, I think, over the last couple of years as well. Like, I remember some big recalls, in the beef and poultry arenas. And so it's interesting, though. I never thought that would be treated, like the food that we eat would be treated with those chemicals, and that we might be consuming them. So,
well, wait a minute. Let me interrupt you for a minute, Justin. And that's part of the education that I think that everybody needs to understand, because people, on the face of it, people will think, oh my gosh, that's bad. Chemicals are bad on my food. You know what? If they didn't use peracetic acid on your chicken, we'd all be dead from salmonella and listeria and foodborne illnesses. I'm telling you, it's you know what one of the biggest advances in health, in general health is? The biggest advancement that saved a lot of people from dying in the world. You know what the biggest advancement is?
No.
Clean water.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
The biggest advancement is chlorine and ways to treat water. And if we didn't have that chemical in it that we use for the water, now I'm not saying that chlorine is the best, because incidentally, they're starting to go to peracetic acid now to clean water. A lot of municipalities are now going to be using peracetic acid. So this is a chemical. Peracetic acid is a chemical that has wide use. And it works very well to kill microorganisms, and it's not harmful in that majorly diluted form. But when you're working with it at its high concentration use, it's very, very dangerous to the worker's health. So, and we'll get into that obviously a little bit more, but I just want to kind of get people to understand, your listeners to understand that, there's misconceptions that people have. And I think we'll probably point some of those out as we go on.
Yeah. And, it's important what you just said, that you really started in healthcare and continue to support, hospitals around the world and really to protect their workers from overexposure. So you just described that, and it's that concentration, right?
It's all about dose. It's all about dose. How much you're exposed to.
And we're going to talk about that, short-term exposure limits and all of those. Right. But I wanted to kind of talk too about, just some things, recent developments, in the industry. And when I say this, I don't even just mean in the United States. We have listeners from across the globe, and there are different approaches across the globe. So we have peracetic acid, and I think you said it's really the most predominant liquid chemical sterilant across the world. But, as we were talking about this, hydrogen peroxide is something that for the last 30 years, everybody's been extremely familiar with in the U.S. market. The thing is, you said to me, hydrogen peroxide is only now just starting to be used in the United Kingdom overseas, which I thought was shocking.
It is shocking. And, I'm glad you brought that up, but I'm also a little bit remiss, honestly, to know the answer to that, Justin. I really don't know why, because they weren't using ethylene oxide either. So the question that I have is, and I'll certainly, now that I'm in tune with this, I'm going to ask, we've been really focused much more on peracetic acid in the UK, and I'll tell you why, and I'll come back to H2O2 if you don't mind. Really, everybody was using glutaraldehyde for years and years and decades, right? That was the predominant high-level disinfection that people use for scopes and things like that. But what happened was, similar to ethylene oxide, over time, people were getting sick. Different types of health issues were coming up working around these chemicals. And so regulatory steps in, and they get, it takes decades, but they get, more and more stringent exposure limits over time to try and keep people safe working around it. So peracetic acid actually in the UK in the early 2000s actually eliminated glutaraldehyde because of safety risk, because of the fact that it was causing asthmas, occupational asthmas. It's a sensitizer. People were having a lot of problems with respiratory issues and things like that, eye, ear, nose, and all that, and throat. And so they basically sacked it, to use their term in the UK. They sacked glutaraldehyde for peracetic acid. Now, here's the point I want to make. Now, studies are coming out. They're showing that peracetic acid causes occupational asthma. It's a desensitizer. It's the same types of things. And this comes back to what I've been saying for 20 years now. These chemicals are designed. They're biocides. Bio means life. CIDE, side means kill. These chemicals are designed to kill, they're biocides to kill life. And exposure limits have been developed. And by the way, let me just clarify that. OSHA is very, very understaffed, underfunded, all that. They always have been. It's worse now than it's ever been. My point is that when they come up with an exposure limit for something, it's serious. They do it because a lot of people are potentially exposed to it. And they don't have time. They don't have time to do, willy-nilly exposure limits. There are hundreds of chemicals out there being used today that are potentially harmful that don't have exposure limits because they have to prioritize. So if you've got an exposure limit on a chemical that you're using, then you need to take that seriously.
That's a really good point. And I know a lot of people out there can understand the impacts of being understaffed and, just what that can do to your ability to manage the workload and really achieve the best case scenario for your practice day in and day out. And so that is something. It really is significant that it's got to be pretty significant of a risk for OSHA to put those exposure limits. And I want to say before we even go on, we use a lot of these acronyms like NIOSH, OSHA, and you're going to hear ppm and time weighted averages, as well as STEL or short-term exposure limit. I want to kind of go back and forth real quick and define these things for the audience, because I don't know that we always did a great job of that in some of our other podcasts. We would talk about it, but I want to give everybody a real concrete understanding, because when you talk about those OSHA guidelines and these exposure limits, a lot of these terms are really important. So let's start with NIOSH. This is the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health. Can you just tell the audience, what's their role in all of this? And then we'll circle back to OSHA after that.
That's awesome. However, I'm going to have to go back a little bit further. So we start out with ACGIH, okay? That's the American Conference of Governmental Industrial Hygienists. They started back in I think at 30s or 40s, right? Back then, they were developing exposure limits for a lot of these chemicals. Back then, they were looking at hydrogen peroxide. Hydrogen peroxide, the first exposure limit was done by ACGIH back in, I think, the 30s or 40s, and it's been 1 part per million ever since. It's never been studied after that significantly, only to the point where they found that it was an animal carcinogen. Take note of that, people. Hydrogen peroxide is an animal carcinogen. Okay, if it's going to kill your dog, you should probably be concerned about it. Now, being exposed to it, okay, the vapors, right? And we'll talk more about that. So ACGIH, and you're right, there's a lot of acronyms. It's alphabet soup. It's hard to track, but ACGIH, American Conference of Governmental Industrial Hygienists, started. Then in 1970, they developed a lot of exposure limits, all of the ones that are in place now, and I'll tell you why. In 1970, President Nixon signed the Occupational Safety and Health Act. 1970, okay? That act created 2 agencies, NIOSH, and National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health. NIOSH is tasked with developing new exposure limits, doing research and developing new exposure limits. OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, they're tasked with enforcement Okay. So a lot of people don't understand. NIOSH, they do the background. They come up with all the exposure limits. OSHA, enforcement. That's all you need to remember. Okay. So now that's it. Now we can get into the specific exposure limits and what all the, what they are and why it's over time and all that kind of stuff. But just to set the stage for this, that's kind of how everything came about. So now you have those three agencies, and ACGIH, by the way, is still the primary organization that creates new exposure limits. And then interestingly enough, because OSHA and NIOSH are severely underfunded. Severely.
So they're basically collaborating in a way,
yes.
Saying, why recreate the work if somebody else is already doing it? Let's all play our own role and try to build something in a bigger picture. But when you talk about those exposure limits, it's measured in parts per million, right? Or ppm when we talk about exposure limits. Is that correct? And what is a ppm?
Well, not always. I mean, a ppm is a lot of the chemicals that we're using, but not all chemicals. I mean, I'll give you a good example. Ethylene oxide. This is a great example because I got into designing detection and monitoring systems because of ethylene oxide, because of the research that I did early on when I first understood ethylene oxide and realized that it was a very serious threat to people's health working around it. And the reason for that, of course, is because you can't smell it, see it, or taste it. And it is a carcinogen. Not that we didn't know that 40 years ago, but just recently it's been designated as a carcinogen. But my point is that ethylene oxide now, the EPA is looking at making an ethylene oxide exposure in the outside, ethylene oxide's commercial sterilization plants. Once they do their process, the ethylene oxide goes out into the atmosphere. Now, EPA is looking at reducing that exposure limit from what it is now, 1 part per million is the occupational exposure limit, but to a part per billion or even per trillion.
Wow.
In the air.
Yeah, we're talking about exponential adjustments in that measurement. Like I'm not sure everybody understands that, right? But you're literally adding another 3 zeros to the end of that per million. So it's millions of millions or millions of millions of millions.
Right. Well, let me put it this way. In ethylene oxide, I just want to use this for a baseline because it's important that people understand that, well, number one, a new chemical coming into the market, it does not have to be proven to be safe over time. It just has to be proven that it's the efficacy, right? So a new chemical comes into the market for its purpose. If it's proven that it works, they do some exposure tests and all that kind of stuff for research, but you can't do research like that, over, a month or a year. Those are the kinds of things that you have to do over decades, right? So what's happening is new chemicals come into the market all the time. And so you have to use good judgment about how you're protecting yourself against these types of things, against exposure to these types of things. So ethylene oxide, a good example, back in the 80s, the exposure limit, believe it or not, was 50 parts per million. Okay, that was over 8 hours. 50 parts per million was considered under that was safe. In the late 80s, 1989, actually a healthcare employee union sued OSHA for a short-term exposure limit, and they won. And that created the 5 part per million short-term exposure limit. Prior to that, it had been the 8-hour exposure limit had been dropped from 50 parts per million down to 1. So in the late 80s, it went from 50 parts per million over 8 hours to 1 part per million over 8 hours, and then an additional 5 parts per million STEL, short-term exposure limit.
All right, so let's pause there really quick because you're talking about tightening restrictions, right? So you said for it to get on the radar for OSHA, it's got to be pretty bad. But now we're talking about it getting more and more on the radar and continuing to lower that. So it almost kind of seems like it keeps getting readdressed, which means it's got to be pretty significant if you could barely get on the radar, but then to keep revisiting it. And I want to define these last two terms because you just threw them out there, but parts per million sounds like a concentration to me, but you kept saying parts per million over 8 hours. Is that what a time weighted average is?
Yeah, exactly. So an average exposure over time, you have the STEL, the short-term exposure limit, which is a 15-minute, generally, a 15-minute time-weighted average exposure.
So it's it's a snapshot in time of a time-weighted average that might be over an 8-hour shift, right? Like
actually, no. There's oftentimes there's two separate. Think of it like this, Justin. It's cumulative. If you've got a time-weighted average exposure, it's 1 over 15 minutes. Or let's take a real example, 5 for ethylene oxide over 15 minutes, okay? 5 parts per million cumulatively over 15 minutes is what they're saying is bad, okay? So what's 5 times 15? 75? So cumulatively, that's your cumulative exposure, and you're supposed to keep your exposure under that. Anything over that is considered to be unsafe. Same thing for the 8-hour average. Same thing. Oftentimes that's called a PEL, permissible exposure limit. That's an 8-hour time-weighted average exposure limit. So for ethylene oxide, it's a 1 part per million time-weighted average over 8 hours.
Okay. I think I really understand this concept now, but sometimes it's one of those things like you see these numbers and then people tell you about it, but to really think about, okay, here I am in the department, and I think it really highlights why you would want monitoring, right? Because if you have a leak in a machine, then your exposure could change and then ultimately exceed these. But again, it's not like necessarily they're saying, and I want you to clarify this for me too, they're not just saying like over 20 years, if you sustain this level of exposure, it's whatever. It really could be this snapshot in time with a leaking machine over 8 hours that could have health impact. Is that correct?
That is correct. But you're also correct in saying that a lot of these things are a lifetime exposure or an exposure over an advanced amount of time. The point is, and you said a couple things that were very significant. One is you said if the machine is leaking. Okay. And I want to specifically mention the fact that we monitor the equipment. Okay. There's the difference between area monitoring and personal monitoring. Area monitoring is more appropriate for this particular industry or this market because it's the equipment that could potentially leak the toxic chemical into your breathing zone, right? So that's one of the reasons that Chemdak is by far the leader in healthcare monitoring these toxic chemicals, these sterilants and high-level disinfectants, liquid chemical sterilants and gas sterilants, is because we specifically design our equipment for the application. So in sterile processing, you've got low temperature sterilizers and you've got liquid chemical sterilants that are being used in AERs. So these chemicals are once again designed to kill. They're biocides. By the way, you don't want, just because they're exposure limits, doesn't mean that you want to breathe any level of these biocides, especially, there's been many studies about this, by the way, especially women of childbearing years, because any amount of toxic exposure could potentially harm that fetus. And how many women work in sterile processing that are in childbearing years? There is no level of toxic chemical that's, good for anybody in that situation. So we want to monitor these things. We want to monitor this equipment. And let me just say right now, I am not saying by any stretch of the imagination that any of these manufacturers don't have the highest level of safety in their products. But I got news for you guys, and your listeners. Even working normally, the equipment, there's what we call fugitive emissions. Just because it's gas, you can't capture all of the gas, right? And it comes all the way back to what we started talking about in the beginning. It's all about dose. It's all about how much you're breathing. And when you're working around a low temperature sterilizer that's using ethylene oxide, hydrogen peroxide, or even the newer ones, ozone and even peracetic acid, by the way, are coming out with a gaseous peracetic acid. So there'll be that probably in the future. Whatever gas or vapor that's coming out of this is potentially harmful. So what's happening is that people are going into these things multiple times a day, right? That you load them, they do their thing, they open up, and you reach in to take things out. When you're reaching in to take things out, there's the potential for fugitive emissions or residual emissions that are still there, still coming off of the product, by the way, that you just sterilized, enough that you're potentially getting exposure over exposure limits. But here's the question, Justin. How do you know?
Mm-hmm. Well, that is the question. And part of the reason I asked and put into context, this short-term, just one shift thing versus long-term exposure was really to say, there might be people out there that are thinking, I went to school to become a surgical tech. I'm working in sterile processing, but I don't plan to be here for more than a year or two, because that does happen. And they might think, oh, this really isn't an issue because I'm not going to be here that long. And, these things require long-term exposure. So I thought it was really important to outline that there's, both short-term and long-term risks here. You said, how do you know? And I think this really takes us to the heart of the conversation, which is, what is it that ChemDAQ is doing? Because I know you as the experts on detection and continuous monitoring, two different things for peracetic acid. But let's talk about how can these departments be sure?
Sure. And that goes back to what we do, what we're best at. As I mentioned earlier, we tailor our equipment design, our monitoring systems to the specific operation in the market. So for sterile processing, for hospital sterile processing departments, it's way different than we monitor. Our systems are designed specifically for that operation. So having said that, the sensor goes at the equipment, close to the door, and then there's a display that can be mounted right on top of the equipment, or it can be mounted on a nearby wall, because you want to be able to see the display, the level that you're dealing with. And the system is pretty much plug and play. If it's a 1-to-1, a sensor on each sterilizer, for instance, with a display, that's as simple as it comes. You can buy that monitor, put it on the equipment, it's plug and play, you're good. And it's continuously monitoring that equipment. Now, if that equipment malfunctions, of course, that sensor will pick it up right away. Or just in normal use, if you're seeing more and more gas over time, or the level's going up higher and higher over time as you open that door, then it's time for maintenance. And this is one way that your department can ensure that the sterilizer or the AER is being maintained properly. Because even though it may not have exceeded the exposure limit yet, it may be creeping up over time. And that's what our customers are telling us all the time.
And you don't want to wait. You don't want to wait until it's already gotten there. That's the whole point about being proactive. I totally relate to that with preventive maintenance. You don't want to repair an instrument after it's hit a point where, it could cause damage to the patient. You want it to make sure that when it's time to sharpen it, it gets sharpened proactively. If you see pitting on an instrument, you want to pull it out of the set immediately. This is kind of the same thing. You essentially want to be monitoring on a regular basis what is happening, what's the trending, so that you're not fixing it after it's already exposing frontline workers to an unacceptable level over 8 hours. And I think that's really powerful what you're saying too. And there's something that you and I talked about, David, that we haven't discussed on the prior interviews. And a lot of it has to do with, what does this look in the department itself? I really want people to conceptualize, what kind of space and how can the data all come together. And I also think sometimes on these shows, people think that the technology really only applies to sterile processing, but this would also go for those GI suites as well. So really any place that these chemicals are used in reprocessing. So I want to put that sort of global conversation out there, especially for the infection control practitioners that listen to these episodes. But something that you said is that you have single and multi-point, multi-gas monitoring systems, not only for ethylene oxide and hydrogen peroxide, but also peracetic acid, and that you can monitor any one of those or all of those in one system. So can you just tell me what you mean by single or multi-point, multi-gas monitoring? Like, what does that mean and what does it look like?
Yeah, like I mentioned earlier, you can get, for instance, a hydrogen peroxide monitor or monitoring system. It's really usually it's 1-to-1. So every sterilizer you have should have a monitor on it, should have which is a sensor, and then a display unit, right? The display unit, the sensor, as I said earlier, should be kind of close to that door opening, be mounted there. So it's got your back. It's always sensing what's going on, whether you're at the equipment or not. And what I was telling you before about personal versus area monitoring, we're talking about area monitoring. We wouldn't want to necessarily need to put something on a person because they're not spending that much time at the equipment. We want to know what the equipment's doing because that's the potential source of the toxic gas. So it's multi-purpose, primarily to keep you safe, but also to let you know there's something going on with that equipment, right? So it's 1-to-1. So let's say you have 2 or more hydrogen peroxide sterilizers. Well, there's a sensor and a display on each one. The display just sits on top of it. You can just set it there, or you can have it mounted on the wall nearby to be able to see. But the point is that you go to open the door and maybe you crack it, just like, you create an SOP, really, a work practice that's going to ensure that you're not going to be exposed to any fugitive emissions. So you put that on there, and then what you do is you open the door, and then you look at the monitor display. Okay, is it going up? If it's going up, you're going to stop until it goes up all the way until it comes back down before you go and reach in there. Now, if over time, many of our customers has seen over time that they install the monitoring system, and then at any given time, it could be going up and down when they open the door or just during general use, right? It's at some level. And then wherever that is it going up? That's what you really want to know. Is it going up over time? And you pay attention to that. But the beauty of our monitoring system is, and you mentioned it earlier, I want to tie in the time-weighted average now with what we talked about earlier. One of the key benefits of our monitoring system, and that I love this because nobody else does this in any industry or any monitoring company, we monitor continuously the appropriate time-weighted averages for that particular chemical. So if it's peracetic acid, and peracetic acid has a 15-minute stel that should not exceed 0.4, less than half of a part per million over any 15-minute period is considered to be unsafe, right? That's nothing. It's nothing. So our monitor literally tracks continuously that 15-minute average through time. So it will give you a warning if it's starting to trend towards where it's going to be over that. So you mentioned earlier the proactive approach that we take. Our monitoring system gives you alerts before it even reaches a point that it's unsafe. That's the key. You don't want something going off after you've been overexposed. So we monitor the current level continuously and the current 15-minute average. And then we give you alerts if it starts to get to a point that looks like it's going to be unsafe. So you can proactively manage that situation instead of reacting to something that's already happened.
Yeah. And I think the one final piece on all of that was really, you and I talked about the fact that you can see all these sensors in one display. It's optional, but you are able to take all these different sensors and put them on one display. So I think personally, I would recommend that. I think you would want to have a hub that would really tell you everything you needed to know if you're a manager or a director, especially across multiple sites.
Well, Justin, I just want to go back because I didn't answer your question fully. I went off on a tangent that I thought people need to understand first. But to answer your question, if you have hydrogen peroxide sterilizers, you have AERs that use peracetic acid, maybe you have ethylene oxide still. Any combination of those, you can have the appropriate monitor and sensor at each piece of equipment. And then all of that can be tied into a central display is what you're talking about. You can monitor each one of those continuously and independently. So all of them, this screen typically is in the manager's office, but we also can have a remote video display in the department so everybody can see each one of those sensors and where they're at continuously while they're working. Because you may be working around ethylene oxide or hydrogen peroxide and have an AER right next to that. So you want to know what everything's doing, and if there's a problem, you want to be able to be alerted at the problem so you can deal with it.
All right. So last section, I want to talk about just some, white papers. So I want to start with the Georgia Tech white paper, and then maybe you can just talk a little bit more anecdotally about reports of high exposure levels, et cetera. But what is this Georgia Tech white paper? What does it tell us?
Well, first, let me tell you that Georgia Tech, not just Georgia Tech, they did a study, but NIOSH and OSHA use our peracetic acid sensor. Chemdak was the first to develop a sensor for peracetic acid, and we're in hundreds and hundreds of hospitals, poultry plants, aseptic packaging. I didn't mention aseptic earlier. They use peracetic acid to sterilize containers that you put food in to extend the shelf life. So that's going on. And the USDA Food Safety Inspection Service also uses our peracetic acid sensor. So all these regulatory agencies are using our sensor technology to do tests, to do white papers, to ensure people are safe working around peracetic acid. Now, unfortunately, again, healthcare seems to be, I don't know why, but there seem to be the red-haired stepchild when it comes to OSHA. OSHA is much more active in industry than they are in healthcare. I don't know why. I think they allow healthcare to self-police. But unfortunately, I keep saying, how do you know? And even though there are exposure limits, what good is an exposure limit, Justin, if you don't have anything to monitor the area to tell you you're over or that you're under the exposure limit? It makes no sense. So we talked earlier about the fact that these chemicals are dangerous enough for these agencies to do the studies and come up with the exposure limits. But if they're not being complied with, what's the purpose? It's difficult for us to really kind of wrap our minds around that. But
all right. So David, what does the Georgia Tech white paper tell us specifically though?
Georgia Tech used Chemdak's technology to do studies in the poultry industry. Georgia Tech is in the middle of the kind of the poultry processing industry, really is kind of centered in and around Georgia. So Georgia Tech used our equipment to go in and do testing to see what kind of levels are in those areas. And what they came up with is that the Chemdak sensor is very, very accurate, and it works very well in that and not as great as it could in that environment because they're spraying water and everything all over the place. But it's just one of the many agencies that are using our sensor technology to do studies. Now, don't forget, peracetic acid is a relatively new chemical. It really is. I mean, it's being used in multiple industries. And so that's why there's such a focus on it from a safety standpoint, because a lot of people are potentially exposed to this.
All right. So I want to tell everybody how they can engage you, because this is really important. And what you just said, that it's a reliable technology, even battle tested, I would say, under extreme conditions. But you're offering free on-site, and this is really critical, confidential safety assessments for gas and liquid chemical sterilants that are used in the departments. Your new monitor, Steri-Trac 2 and 2 Plus, they can get a new customer discount when they mention this podcast. It's a limited time offer, so say that you heard about the new monitor and about ChemDAQ by listening to the Beyond Clean podcast, and you're discontinuing the ST1, and so that, or Steri-Trac 1. So if they want to upgrade, then there's a trade-in allowance there as well, which I think is amazing, David, right? Because so many times people discontinue a product and it's like, you just have to buy new. But the fact that you're really working with your customer base to stay ahead in the technology and continue to receive the benefits of your developments as a company, I think is great. I just want to thank you so much for coming on the show again today, and especially just really taking that deep dive into a lot of the technical terms that I think will help people understand why this is so important. I think you really helped put it into context. Thank you so much for coming on.
Well, thank you, Justin. I just want to say before I sign off here that if you're a frontline sterile processing technician, or you're working in the endoscopy, you're working around peracetic acid, hydrogen peroxide, ethylene oxide, you have every right in the world to be concerned about your safety in your work environment. And there are specific regulations that support that. The employer is bound by duty and by regulation to ensure a safe work environment. So go to your manager, go to your supervisor and tell them, look, I'm concerned about my work. I want to know what the levels of these toxic chemicals in my work environment. I'm concerned about it. If you're a supervisor or manager, go to your administration. Explain to them that the HAZCOM standard, OSHA's general duty clause, and all of the specific regulatory standards that are in place to protect the worker. Exposure limits are no good if you're not monitoring and you can't detect, you don't know what's happening in your department. That's how we approach things. If you don't know, you can't take action if you don't know what's going on. Are you safe? How do you know? ChemDAQ can help you to understand your work environment and keep you safe.
That was David Hilliker, President and CEO at ChemDAQ. And ChemDAQ's been a good partner with Beyond Clean, releasing a lot of CE-approved educational content. One of our very first partners in creating social media-based education. So definitely visit their LinkedIn page or go to chemdak.com to find more information about that. And especially if you're interested in learning more about this topic, there's lots of educational resources, and it kind of breaks it out in small chunks and really focuses on so many of the elements of the conversation that we had today. But it also can get you CE credits for your recertification. And I think the biggest takeaway from David, and it's a message that he's been sharing with our audience for quite some time now, but are you safe and how do you know? And so I think this continuous monitoring, and it's not just peracetic acid. I know we talked a lot about that today, but hydrogen peroxide and ethylene oxide as well. And so I think, the employer, and we've talked about OSHA, it doesn't get on their radar unless it's really serious, but it's really serious. But if you aren't monitoring, you don't know if it's really serious at your facility. And so employers really have a legal and ethical responsibility to provide a safe workplace. That's an OSHA mandate. But ultimately, I think a key takeaway is that we as individuals are all responsible for our own health. And so not just at work, but in all areas of our lives. And, if you were about to go into a non-work environment, if you knew that work environment was above the short-term exposure limit with some sort of a chemical, would you go into that area? And so when you're working day in and day out, I think it's important, because right now, how would you know if you're not doing chemical monitoring? So finally, if you're a manager, you can contact ChemDAQ at sales@chemdak.com for more information. You can schedule that on-site confidential safety assessment. You can request a quote. And then you can share this ChemDAQ vendor spotlight or research on your own on the ChemDAQ website, chemdak.com. And just remember, also, new monitors, there's a discount if you mention this podcast. So say you heard about it on Beyond Clean. And if you're already utilizing the ChemDAQ monitors and you have the Steri-Trac 1, there's a trade-in allowance there as well. Just a great job today, David. Thank you for continuing to educate on employee safety on the Beyond Clean platform. That's going to do it for this week's show. As a reminder, you can help support Beyond Clean by subscribing on Apple, Amazon, or Google Podcasts, as well as Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or on your favorite podcast podcast application. You can also access bonus content for certain episodes by downloading our smartphone application for iPhone and Android. We'd certainly appreciate a rating and a review because your feedback is important to the show. And if you have any topics that you'd like us to cover on a future episode, just send an email to info@beyondclean.net. Thank you for listening to this week's Vendor Spotlight on Beyond Clean.